I don't think our society's ready for that. I don't think our government's ready for that. I don't think anybody's really thought about what does that look like. There was a really great study from the World Bank Africa about a year ago that they did a study in a school in Nigeria where they gave students tablets with AI tutor bots. And what they found is for the students, what I referred to earlier is the authentication crisis. How do we know that a student is doing their work or they're handing it off? And the bigger concern is not just handing off aspects of it, but really handing off all of the cognitive work to an AI.
Anand, welcome to the World XP podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Eric. How about you?
Can't complain. It's a little bit chilly, of course, as we were discussing offline. But yeah, house is still going and power's still on, so can't complain too much. You want to do a quick intro for the people who you are and what you do, and then we'll hop right into it?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Anand Rao. I'm a faculty member at the University of Mary Washington. I've been there since 2002, and I'm a faculty member in communication, helped found our Department of Communication and Digital Studies, and I was the founding chair of that department for 4 years. And now I have just founded a new Center for AI and the Liberal Arts, which I'm director of. And I'm spending a lot of my time now looking at the impact of AI on education, on society, and really a focus on how do we prepare our students for an AI world.
Very nice. Question from the last guest, and there's a point that I'll emphasize in the question, but it says, can you tell me a moment that quietly changed the direction of your life or career? I think quietly is the key word here.
That's interesting. I guess probably the one thing that comes to mind immediately is when I was an undergraduate, I was planning on going to law school. And I had planned on going to law school even my senior year in college as a philosophy major. I had no idea of going into academia at all. And there was just an offer made by my debate coach. I was on the college debate team. And he said, why don't you stick around for a year? We can give you an assistantship. You can get a master's degree, and you can always go to law school later. And so I thought about it and said, yeah, that seems like a pretty good opportunity. Get a master's for free. I get to coach debate, which I love the activity. And that really changed the course of my life in many ways, because it allowed me an entry into academia in a way that I hadn't really thought about. I started teaching and realized I really enjoyed that. Ended up completing my doctorate, and then still thought early on about going back to law school. I mean, even my dissertation was on a legal topic, the admissibility of scientific evidence in courts. But that simple interaction, I guess it was fairly quiet, really changed the course of my life.
Very nice. That's a great answer. It's like one little suggestion or offer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Serendipity. It's
yeah.
amazing how often those little serendipitous moments come around. Of course, because they're serendipitous, you don't know when they're coming. You don't know what they're going to look like. And that's something I've tried to share with my own kids, is just be open to those possibilities. You never know what might come about.
Yeah. But when you're sharing things like this with maybe your students at Mary Washington, specifically when it comes to maybe new technology, or you guys are or you're in an instance in which the field is changing or there's a new field, how do you go about actively incorporating that to make sure that the students are prepared both for the workplace, but also to make sure that you are not kind of left behind? Because I think, at least in my head, there can be and maybe this is less true in your universities and more true in like high school, middle school, where you can just kind of get comfortable with the curriculum that you have. But how do you make sure that both for yourself and for your students that you're staying up to date with new things that are going on, and of course specifically centered around AI, in this perspective? But how do you go about doing that from both for you and for your students, and making sure that you understand enough to then explain it to the students, and then also vice versa? Sometimes the students are playing around with things that you don't know about, and so it's a kind of a give and take, I would imagine. But how does that sort of phenomenon happen with a new industry or a change in industry?
It's funny. I was talking to a colleague a little bit about this, thinking about how faculty respond to changes. One thing to recognize about college faculty is that we're trained to be hyper specialized, very focused in one particular area. That's typically what you're doing in your graduate studies. So you're writing a dissertation on something that only a handful of people around the world, in most cases, really understand or know, and you direct your research that way. And because of that, it can be really difficult to keep up with new changes, because unless you're really focusing on something that is kind of everyday or is kind of resonates with the rest of society, you're missing out on a lot of other things outside of maybe your own personal time. I think one thing that's a little different about my academic trajectory is that my background was really in history and philosophy of science and technology. I was always very interested in technological change and thinking about how it would be deployed in different ways. My dissertation was about how science gets brought into the courtroom. I was always interested in thinking about policy making around science and technology. And so that was more of a general interest, and incorporate that into a lot of courses that I was teaching. But I think from an early time, I was always thinking about how can we make use of technology to be more efficient, to be able to do better work. And part of that, I think, is maybe a difference of coming at it as a debate coach. I was a debate coach for the first 7 years as a faculty member at another university, and I debated since I was a kid. And when you're thinking about kind of practical application and very limited time frame, limited resources, you're trying to find ways to do it better. And so I think I always had that approach where I was thinking in maybe a little more practical way than I might have otherwise. And so early on, I was always thinking about new technologies I mean, at the time, think of it this way in the timeline. When I entered graduate school, it was in 92. We weren't even really given email addresses. The World Wide Web had just been invented, and most people didn't know what it was about. And so I remember making friends with some researchers at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center just to be able to stay on top of and to see what the web was, see early websites, to be able to see how to design a website, how it was being used by researchers around the world. At that point, it was just monochrome, screens that you were accessing. You didn't have anything in color, didn't have any video, certainly very limited bandwidth. And so I think I was always intrigued with that technological change, what that was going to look like. When I came to Mary Washington early on, I started teaching some courses that were related to that, especially with social media. I started teaching a social media class, and I think it was probably like 2005 that I first started teaching that. And I remember maybe it was around just before Facebook started taking off and students had access to it. And so I taught that for a number of years. We still have it regularly taught by other adjuncts now and other faculty that are teaching it. So I was always interested in seeing, what is this going to mean, kind of trying to look around the corner a little bit. What is this going to mean for the way that we interact, for the way we socialize, the way we communicate? What are the societal implications of this technology? And for social media, that was pretty big. I talk about this in terms of AI. When I look back on that, I think I was, like a lot of people, a little naive about what social media was going to mean for society, and had no sense of something like Cambridge Analytica happening in 2016, or the impact of Instagram on young people. At that point in the early 2000s, it was really more of a optimistic view of, this is going to bring the world together. We have connections we never would have had before. So there's a very long-winded answer, but what I'm getting at is that I was always very intrigued in that. And I think that's part of the reason that we even designed the department as communication and digital studies. I was part of the faculty group that helped design the early minor in digital studies, and that incorporated classes from across the curriculum that were looking at digital tools, new technologies, and exploring some of the societal implications, some political questions, as well as just what it meant for interpersonal interaction. And kind of the culture of media and technology was always very important. So that directed the development of the major in 2015, and then developing that as a major, a new department in 2020. And so we've always spent a lot of time thinking about, what are the next steps? How are these technologies going to be changing? The other aspect of this that I think has been really instructive for me over the last 12 or 15 years is really a focus not just on kind of the curiosity of technology or thinking about how that'll change, but also thinking about, how do we prepare students for an ever-changing world? It's become apparent that things are accelerating, that the type of technological change we're seeing is accelerating in ways that are unforeseen. And if you have a student that's coming in as a first-year student, and if they're going to graduate in 4 or 5 years, what is that scene going to look like? What is that career, that discipline going to look like? How can we prepare them for that job? I think it was a lot easier for faculty when I was an undergraduate in the late 80s, early 90s, to have a sense of what jobs would look like, because they were a little more static. They didn't change nearly as often. But once you start getting on to that exponential curve, and you're thinking about the introduction of the internet, social media, more advanced technologies, and things are changing rapidly, even before we started really focusing on specifically AI, there was a concern that the industries are changing so rapidly. How do we give our students the facility to deal with that kind of change? They need some flexibility. They need to be able to learn how to learn. And I think that's been part of the major since we first designed it, over 10 years ago. Um, Now, what does that mean now with AI? I've spent the last several years focusing pretty much exclusively on AI. And, we were always talking about AI and learning about AI through digital studies courses. So it's not like it was a new topic. But I think, like many, the introduction of generative AI and especially the ChatGPT moment, I remember earlier that year looking at DALL-E and looking at what it was able to do with images, and it was pretty astounding. Even then, it was very crude, it was very basic, but it was surprising at how good it was at developing, creating visuals. And then a few months later, when ChatGPT came out in November 22, it was readily apparent to me and a few colleagues that this is really going to change everything. So we even organized in January of 23 a webinar just for to help faculty kind of navigate some of this, to get a sense of where is this going, what do we think can be done, how do we address the authentication crisis that many faculty were thinking about. Ever since then, I've been focusing really exclusively on that. All of my research, pretty almost all of my teaching, and I've really directed all of my efforts in that direction, because I think it's something that we really need to find a way to better prepare students for.
Yeah. The 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 Dolly example, I think one is interesting to me because to me it comes to the example of AI music. I don't know if you've seen
Yeah.
some of these, but some of them are very, very good. And like
Hmm.
one popped up, it was just on like a YouTube playlist, and the first couple were like real songs, and then I was
Yeah.
driving, and then the next one, I was like, oh, I like this song, and then I like looked at who it was, and in my head I was like, this has to be AI. There's no way this is not AI because there's no like person on the YouTube channel, there's no nothing, and then it's just four or five songs with the same like it's a cover of in that genre of whatever the song was. I was like, oh wow, that got me for a second. And so that's an interesting one. But to go back to the creation of the major, I think I remember when that happened because I was at Mary Washington when that happened. Maybe I'm dating myself slightly, but that's okay. Um, and I wanted to go back to just more generally when you create a new class or a new major or a new um, like minor, how does that work? And for you being kind of on the forefront of, you said you started t teaching social media class in '05, that's super early. Do you get pushback at all for some of these things? Like, oh, it's not going to be a huge deal, or if not, how do you go about actually creating the class and the curriculum, and how much freedom do you have in doing so? And the other reason I bring that up is because there were some classes, and I know at Mary Washington it was you could design your own major as a student, which I thought was very cool. And I if I had maybe gone back now, I would have more foresight and actually having some sort of like, yes, I actually want to learn about these things instead of just like, oh, I need these classes. Anyways, I digress. But what sort of freedom and how does that actually work to create your own class, create your own major? Obviously, I would imagine for the major you would need a lot more faculty input, but just to like create a class, how does that work?
Sure. I think it really varies by university, certainly, even by departments and programs. And the reason that's important is that if you're in a program that is in high demand and you have a lot of students that are majors, and you have to offer a number of sections of the required courses in the major, then there's not as much flexibility in the schedule to be able to offer something new. Now, even there, most departments will allow for special topics courses to be offered. I think it's important as electives in the major for being able to expose students to new topics and new areas. But there's probably less flexibility in that instance. And the reason I frame it that way and to start with it is that when I came to Mary Washington in 2002, we did not have a communication major. And in fact, we had some communication courses. I was only the second faculty member in communication. At that point, we were called speech. It was the English, linguistics, and speech department changed to communication. But because we didn't have a major, as long as the courses we offered were speaking intensive, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Mary Washington, we have an across the curriculum requirement of writing intensive. So you have to have 4 writing intensive courses before you graduate. Speaking intensive, 2 of courses have to be speaking intensive. And what's great about that is then the intent is that you aren't just taking a speech class like public speaking, which many people do, and I taught that for many years. But you could also take a speaking intensive course in your major, which is ideal. And so part of my job was to work with the speaking intensive program. I directed the speaking intensive program, well, for the first 20 years that I was here, and working with faculty in other departments to develop speaking intensive assignments, assessment, and guidance, and really instruction on communicating within that discipline. And so if you're a biology major, your senior seminar is speaking intensive, and you learn how to present as if you're presenting to other scientists. And often those students will go present at a conference. Really excellent way to develop those communication skills specific to that discipline and that field that they might be going into. They also need general communication skills. So when I came in, as long as I was teaching courses that were speaking intensive, I was given a lot of latitude because the courses, some of them would count as the English major, but most of them, they were just courses that were satisfying a general elective. So students would take them. It was usually in high demand. I could teach almost anything I wanted, which was great. And so I remember teaching environmental rhetoric a number of times and social media, and I could teach a documentary film class. I developed several first-year seminars. And so there were lots of courses that I was able to teach. And so I had more flexibility and leeway to do that with individual classes. And I really didn't receive any pushback. I mean, I think for certain topics, I know we're having discussions with faculty about concerns about social media early on, and that was great to discuss with them, or talking about new communication technologies, that kind of interaction, but never really pushback about why are you offering that class. I don't think I've ever really received that. Now, as far as developing the minor, when we developed the minor in digital studies, it came about because a number of faculty we developed that intensive designation, digital intensive. I'm trying to remember if that happened first or we just had courses that were kind of digital studies relevant. And a number of us were teaching courses like this. I taught a visual rhetoric class at the time that was incorporated a lot of digital skills and tool sets. Students were developing their own visual artifacts, making their own commercials, for instance, developing visual ads so that then they could then analyze them in class. So it wasn't just analysis, but it was also kind of practice, getting them to think about developing visuals from a rhetorical perspective. And so that was one of the courses that was involved in early on in the minor. And so it was a group of faculty coming together, had a proposal. We were able to present that to the general faculty, and it was approved as a minor, as a digital studies minor. And that was well before we had a communication digital studies major. And so there have been minors that have been developed that way. It's usually a group of faculty working together. Sometimes it's faculty within a department. You could have a minor in literature, for instance, and that would be within the English department. Some of them are more interdisciplinary, like digital studies or women and gender studies and sexuality. That's one that's more interdisciplinary. And that's often just comes about because there are a number of faculty that come together saying, we would like to contribute to this. We want this as an option for students. And I can't really think of any examples of ones that came about that weren't approved. I think generally they go through that vetting process. Academics move fairly slowly through governance processes. So it takes a number of months before it's really reviewed. Everybody has a chance to comment. Different departments can talk about whether or not they should have that course in their major included because they already have a high demand or they're thinking about other resources. All of those discussions take place. And then you end up having it approved and it's in place for the following year.
Mm. The more I learn about how curriculums are structured, especially in more like the I'll say like hard sciences and maybe some history and like I was a geography major, so a lot of stuff, the more it makes sense, one from just an outside perspective looking in, but two, it when I was a student, some of the stuff didn't make sense. Also, I didn't really t take the time to think about why it was the way it was. But the writing intensive and the speaking intensive, I think, have been super helpful. One, the speaking intensive, I think, probably partially gave me a good enough platform of verbal communication to start this and not feel like
Look
an
what you're
idiot.
doing now. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Although I will say, with that said, if I go back to the first 10, 20 episodes, I prefer to not listen to those
It's all
back.
about practicing.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
100%, 100%. But to kind of deep dive into the class thing, what goes into actually making the class? So you're like, okay, I've got an idea for a class. Faculty seems to think it's a good idea. Then you actually have to have things and assignments that you want to teach in a
Mhm.
way that sort of makes sense. So like, how does that thought process work? Of course, for different disciplines and subjects, the answer is going to be slightly different, of course. But generally speaking, how do you go about that?
Well, and as you noted, really varies by discipline. It varies by department. It depends on what the purpose of the course is. If it's trying to meet a particular need in the department, and let's say a requirement in the major or even an elective in the major. There's a reason why we have that space in the curriculum. I joke that we move fairly slowly, but the reason that academics do that, academia moves fairly slowly, is that it's a very thoughtful process. And we want to make sure that we're leaving no stone unturned. We're really thinking about what are the learning outcomes that we have in mind for students. What is it that they should get out of this experience? And if it's a requirement somewhere for a minor, for a major, for a general elective, a general education requirement, then that's an important set of learning outcomes that we have in mind. If it's, if I have a new course, let's say go back 20 years and I'm teaching a new course or developing social media for the first time, I'm going to have a designated speaking intensive. So there's some learning outcomes that are speaking intensive related that I need to incorporate. And that means that I need to make sure that I have a certain number of assignments, certain type of assessment, a chance for students to be able to learn from early feedback, to be able to incorporate into later assignments. I incorporate enough instruction so students can work on that skill set. So that provides a bit of the skeleton of the course, even without thinking about the content. Any speaking intensive course is going to include, and it depends on when it's offered or what the current requirements are, but it'll typically include a number of assignments, a chance for students to reflect on their communication practices. Different types of assignments could be a presentation, could be class discussion, but usually we would look for several of those, and some substantive portion of the final grade. Not a majority, but it's not just throwaway points. It's not something, we aren't grading this, but we're including speeches. Students need to see that this is a priority for the instructor. So that would be an important component of this. If I were also including learning outcomes for the major, like if I'm saying this is going to be a requirement in the major, then maybe there's some things that I would have some discussion with colleagues in the department. Hey, what else should I make sure this includes? Because students will take this, they might not take some other electives. Let's make sure that we meet certain needs in the major or certain expectations that we might have. If I'm teaching, we have a great mechanism where we can teach a special topics class, and pretty much every discipline allows for this. And you can even do one that's outside of the major, but typically you do it within your discipline, because that's where your expertise is. And so I could teach a special topics class in communication or digital studies, and I'm given a lot of leeway. And I can teach that course up to 3 times as a special topics class. And after that, the expectation is I'm either not going to be teaching it again because maybe I only wanted to teach it once or twice. I've done that before. When we did the Freedom Ride celebration in 2011, I remember teaching a documentary film class about documenting social movements. And we just had a class where they went and made documentaries about the Freedom Ride celebration, which was great. It was the only time I offered it. Special topics, perfect mechanism for that. I didn't have to get it formally approved. But if you want to keep it on the books, then it has to be approved through a different process. Special topics just within the department. After that, it has to be approved by the faculty as a permanent course. And that's something you're expected to teach regularly. And then it goes through a different kind of vetting, a different kind of process for review. Now, when I approach teaching a new class, I think about those learning outcomes. I think about what's the purpose of the class. And then I also think there are a lot of different ways to go about it. If it's a first year seminar, I probably am going to provide a lot more guidance, a lot more structure. I want to make sure that that's going to be very different. I'm teaching it online. That's a whole other ballgame. I want to make sure that there are different touch points. There's a lot of structure. It's more accessible. I've taught synchronous, online, asynchronous. Those are very different because synchronous, I can meet with students and talk to them and I can find out what they're thinking. If I don't have that, I can't just wait for them to email me when there's a question. I have to give them enough structure and guidance that they have everything that they really need there online, hopefully. And then there are going to be gaps and then they'll be able to reach out to me. Now, take a simpler example. If I'm just going to meet with them face to face and I'm thinking about a new class, so 2023, I was teaching a ChatGPT and generative AI class for the first time. And I thought my goal here was to make sure that students learned about generative AI, not just from TikToks, which most students were learning about, right? They knew ChatGPT was out there. They knew about Perplexity when it came out, but they didn't really understand how it worked. They didn't really understand how they could build their own bots. And so I built it in such a way that they were learning some of the background about how generative AI worked. I wanted them to look at some critical articles and some literature about generative AI and the development of AI and what it might mean societally. I wanted them to think a bit about what they could do technically. So we were able to use a no-code coding platform platform where they built their own bots. And this is even back in 2023, where they built their own bots, trained it on their own documents, and they were able to test it in different ways. And, I had projects that were built in, and we had a lot of class discussion about things. I also found that and this often happens, I'll change things mid-course. If there's a need that needs to be addressed, or maybe students catch something and they're on top of it, and I can move ahead a little bit, maybe we'll add another assignment, or maybe we realize we need to spend more time on something, we'll drop something else. It's really, for me, focused on what are the students going to be able to get out of this experience. What do I need to do to provide them with that opportunity? And then let's see where they can run with it. And hopefully they're motivated to really take advantage of that and do something with it. And if not, that's a little more challenging. And it depends on what brought them there. That's the other benefit of a special topics class. If they're taking it because they're interested in the topic, then that's better than a student taking a class. Oh, well, it's a requirement, I just have to take this class. I might not be that interested. And that's a little different. That changes the certainly the dynamic in the class.
Yeah, I'm sure you had a bunch of those for the speaking intensive ones. People that were
There are
just in
always some of
there.
those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's always a handful for sure. Last kind of academia, more focused question, just because I've been curious about this. But
Yeah.
when you decide on like learning outcomes for a major, like, okay, students graduating with a major in communications, they should know blank. Like, how does that work? Because at least in my head, you should go to university to basically one get at least at Mary Washington, right, where it's liberal arts and it's not really. I mean, you'll be specialized in whatever your major is, but you get a broad range of things that you learn. In my head, it's like you learn how to speak, you learn how to write, and then you get prepared to get a job in whatever that you majored in, ish, broadly speaking. So for some stuff, you'll hear people on the outside be like, "Oh, yeah, you took out all these loans to get a degree where there's no jobs. Like, congratulations."
Yeah.
But like, and sometimes communications is lumped into that. I've seen that before, and I don't really agree. But also like from the perspective of, well, yeah, it's not software engineering or something else where you just go
Mhm.
like straight into that field. So how does that work? Like how do you guys when you're sitting as a faculty be like, okay, we want students to be prepared for the real world and we want them to know blank. Like how does that work?
Yeah. And this again changes by discipline. I mean, and when you're like the examples that you're given, I was an undergraduate philosophy major, and so I wasn't necessarily thinking about becoming a professional philosopher. Right? There are some
Yeah.
opportunities for that. You go into academia, but I was actually thinking about going into law because there are a lot of similar skill sets there. I think that when we're thinking about and considering the needs of our students, you outlined a lot of this already. We want students to learn how to think. We want them to learn how to think critically, to be good citizens, to be good members of society, to be able to be ethical, and to know what that means, and to have a better guidance on how they're going to live a good life. And then for many students, of course, there's the recognition that they are going to need to get a job, and that's what they're looking for. Is they're looking for the preparation to be able to get that job, whatever field it is that they're going to. That'll vary. For some students, they're looking for something that's more prescribed. They want to do a very specific thing. They need a specific set of skills. And in that case, if let's say it's accounting, then there are certainly to prepare you to be an accountant. And we know that there are very formalized structures for accrediting somebody, getting a certificate, being able to be licensed accountant. We know exactly what that outcome is going to look like. How do we prepare them for that? That makes it a little bit easier because you can say, well, these are the skills we need to teach in the classroom. When we were developing the communication digital studies major, we wanted to find the right mix because you don't just think of everybody with a communication degree coming out and doing the same thing. Certainly many will go into corporate communications, public relations, marketing. There's a lot of that, of course. But we also were a communication digital studies major. So it wasn't just communication, but it was also thinking about incorporating digital skill sets and digital video production, media production, social media management. Those are all areas that, when I first came to Mary Washington, nobody ever would have thought about being a social media manager. We didn't even have social media yet. So we had to incorporate that in. What we worked on, and I ended up producing a lot of this, for a new major, it has to be approved for a public school by the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia. And that's a good process because they're looking at how different universities across the state are providing different degree plans, opportunities for students, make sure there's not too much duplication. I mean, every college campus should have a math department and they should have math as an area of study. So it's not to say you don't want to duplicate. If you want to math, you have to go to this school. But they also want to make sure that you aren't building out a lot of capacity in an area that maybe there's not a need for in the state. So that's a little bit of it. There's certainly a consideration of what does this mean for career prospects. And so I remember going through and doing a lot of research, talking to people in industry, looking at our kind of the national organization. We have National Communication Association. They had a lot of resources talking about people with communication degrees, the kinds of jobs they go into, what the skill sets are that people are looking for, reading through a lot of surveys and materials and research about what employers are looking for generally for people, because a communication degree, often when you're looking for a typical entry level corporate job, they say a business degree or a communication degree. So some of our students aren't going to go into something communication specific, but maybe going into a general corporate job. And we need to be able to prepare them for that a little bit too. But then the other thing I did is I remember looking at hundreds of job ads for a lot of those jobs to see what are the skill sets, what are the experiences, what are they looking for in terms of portfolio, and then trying to reverse engineer that so that the major would help students, give them the opportunity to be able to develop those skills, to have those materials and have them ready. The complication, of course, is we aren't preparing all students for one job or one type of job. And so we have some students that are taking a more, let's say, creative pathway where they're thinking about going into video production, media production, and they're doing something that's more akin to the arts. They need to develop a portfolio and different skill set than maybe somebody going to social media management, very different than somebody going into event planning, which is also something people with communication degrees go into. And that's different than somebody that's going to go into graduate studying communication to be a faculty member in communication. We've had a few students that have done that too. So it kind of is all over the place. And part of it is making sure that we provide those opportunities for students to explore. And a lot of it comes down to advising. That's one of the benefits at Mary Washington. I hope you had this experience, is that, and I think about when I went to undergrad and I had graduate students that were advising me, and I had a different advisor every year, if not every semester, because their turnover, right? They didn't really
Mhm.
know the curriculum. At Mary Washington, the faculty do the advising and we wrote the curriculum. So it's a lot easier to be able to say, yeah, we designed this class with this in mind. This is a class for you. Tell us about what you're interested in. We can guide you. We can tell you who to talk to. And so hopefully when that advising works well, and I think generally it does, if the students really seek it out, they get that guidance to know, here's the particular path for you within the major, within the university to get where you want to go.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I've got a gazillion more questions, but for the people that clicked on this because they wanted to learn about AI, sorry about the first half an hour not being related to that whatsoever. Um, so when ChatGPT kind of hits the scene late 22, early 23, um, where are you guys at as a faculty in terms of like, I'm sure you had a handful of students already using it to like write papers for them and do all the
Yeah.
rest of the stuff. And so I'd imagine that that's the first, like there's two problems to tackle, which is one, it's not going away. So how do we use it productively as a resource? But then two, the people that are using it kind of in a maybe with less, I don't know, I don't want to say cheating, but like that sort of intent, right? You've got two, like, where's the line
Yeah.
between that and the using it as a productive resource? And so, how did that work for you guys in terms of one, what were those sorts of discussions like? Two, how much trial and error was there with students? Like, I'm sure you had some instances where you're like, this is probably on the line, kind of like it looks like it was a resource, but maybe not. Like, so there's a lot of feeling out that happens. How did that process work at Mary Washington?
Yeah, this is what you're highlighting are problems that academics across the country and around the world are dealing with, and they're largely not resolved still. And I think Mary Washington, we've done a better job than most. And even early on, we were having discussions among the faculty about this technology and what it looks like. So I remember spring of 23, and this is just months after ChatGPT had come out. Within 2 or 3 months, as I mentioned, some colleagues and I outside of the university ran a workshop that January to talk a bit about this, and that was really geared toward letting people understand what is this disruptive technology and how do we deal with it as faculty. And I remember in February having a discussion, open forum for all faculty, and over 100 faculty members came. And I remember being on a panel talking a bit about This is not that different than the introduction of the printing press or the change from an oral tradition to a writing tradition. And Plato's Phaedrus talked a bit about this. That we were trying to prepare faculty to think about how is this going to change the process of education. Now, that question of what I referred to earlier is the authentication crisis. How do we know that a student is doing their work or they're handing it off? And the bigger concern is not just handing off aspects of it, but really handing off all of the cognitive work to an AI bot, a chat bot. And a lot of faculty early on would complain because they could tell, that it wasn't written very well. Early Chat GPT wasn't great. At that time, we thought it was pretty great. But when you compare to what it's capable of now, you can certainly see some stark differences. That January workshop that we did, the webinar that we did, was really focused on that. And several of us started working, and we actually put together a book that was published in March of 23 called, it was about ChatGPT and AI in education. And a lot of it was looking at how do we address the change in the classroom and the authentication crisis. That authentication crisis is a big one that a lot of schools are still grappling with. And we hear about AI detectors, or how do we make sure students are doing their work. And it's why some schools and faculty are going back to blue books and having students
Blue
handwrite
books.
or oral exams. The early reaction that my colleagues and I had, and this is in part our own bias because we come back from a background of communication and debate, is that if we want to authenticate student learning, one of the best ways to do that is to go back to what we've been doing for millennia, and that is student communication. So have them give a presentation. If they could handle a robust Q&A after that presentation, then at least we know they've learned the content. Even better, we've been promoting the use of debate to be able to fully assess student work, because it doesn't matter who wrote the speech for you. And this is also kind of interesting to characterize. When you come from a background of competitive debate, if you're on a debate team, you're not doing all the work yourself. You have a team. You're used to other people contributing to the effort. So if you have a topic for that year, you have your coaches doing some of the work, you have debaters doing some of the work, you're rewriting each other's work, you're collaborating in really important ways. That doesn't mean you aren't learning enough, because there's no way you could be competitive and learn the whole topic on your own. You have to be able to work with others. That's the right model that we said earlier. Even from January 23, we've been talking about, it was part of that book, been part of other publications that we've had, that's the model to think about AI with. Look at it with that eye. Use it as a collaborator. Find a way that it can be incorporated into the workflow so that it doesn't take away from student agency, but it spurs it on. It gives students greater capabilities. It gives them the ability to access information in a better way, that they can still think very critically. Debaters think very critically. And just because somebody might have written their speech for them doesn't mean they don't learn the arguments. But the way to tell is whether or not they can get through that debate. I mean, I don't know anybody that can get through a debate without knowing the content. You have to be able to be fluent in the way you can explain the arguments, defend the arguments, attack other arguments. And if you can do that, then I'm convinced you know that content really well. And that's really what we're about primarily, is figuring out how can you learn that content if we're thinking about content focused courses, or if we're thinking about process oriented focus courses, then having those critical thinking skills demonstrated through an active debate, that satisfies my concerns, and I think there are a lot of interesting ways you can go about that. So as part of the research group that I'm in, we've been advocating that for years now, and even before that we talked about debate across the curriculum as the best way to help students develop critical thinking skills. And for AI, it's just a natural fit. Let's teach students how to use it responsibly, and really that means understanding the expectations in whatever that situation is, because you can't say that it's cheating across the board if somebody's giving you permission to use it, right? That's not
Yeah.
cheating by definition then, right? So in the workplace, there are a lot of different directions we can kind of take this, but let me kind of share this to put it in context. I remember a colleague sharing this on a discussion board about a year ago, and she was saying that her son, she's a college professor at another university, her son was in an internship and was asked to write a press release, and came back with the press release. And the supervisor said, well, did you use ChatGPT to write this, or did you write it? He said, oh, I wrote it myself. She said, I don't want you to waste your time writing it yourself. I want you to have ChatGPT write the draft. I want you to revise it. That's a better use of your time. So he's worried, if I use an AI tool, it's cheating, it's not doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing it. And his boss is saying, Your time is valuable. I want you to use some of these tools. It's kind of like saying I don't want you to hand long write this on a legal pad. I want you to type it. Or better yet, use a voice typing tool so you don't have to type it and it's a lot faster. What can we do to make it more efficient? And that doesn't mean you just outsource it and you take whatever generative AI is giving you, ChatGPT is giving you, and turning it in and handing that off as the press release. I want you to review it. I want you to revise it. I want you to edit it and make it better. And that's a better use of your time than doing it all from scratch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even at my day job, that's one of the things that I did to be much more efficient. I was able to churn out documents and even like create prompts to review documents for certain things, like simple things that saved me half an hour here, hour there.
Yeah.
And it makes you a lot more efficient. And then people are wondering like how you got things done so quickly, and you're like, oh, that's a secret, and I'm not going to tell you. No, no, no. But I think to your point about the debate and the oral presentation and getting through the Q&A, I think that is, I mean, I think that's a great solution to the problem. And because then it's like, yeah, you can have ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever make the slides for you, but if you don't know what the material is, like you're toast at that point. And and even speaking, like thinking back to my own experience, there were certain things, certain classes where like I knew going in if I was more prepared than others, and I knew that there was going to be a Q&A. Usually it revolved around how interested I was in the class, but like I remember for some classes that maybe would have been considered air quotes easier. It's like I wasn't interested. And then there was other ones where I could make the presentation into something that I was interested in within the class. So like in a Spanish 202 class, I was able to make a presentation about the World Cup. I love soccer. And then all of a sudden it made it a lot easier and I could like bungle through the Spanish a little bit, but I knew all the answers to the questions because I loved what I was doing and I was interested in it. And then it made everything a lot easier. So even with like ChatGPT could have made the slides for me for sure, but I still knew the material. And then same thing with my GIS capstone project, the presentation for that one. Like it was a tough class. Like the people that were doing amazing projects and stuff. And I used my internship. And then once the Q&A came around, I was so much more comfortable than I normally would have been because I knew I had lived the internship for the last 18 months or whatever it
Yeah.
was. And so yeah, I think that's a great way to do it, and then you might get some chuckles around the room when people get caught. But you know, I mean that's part of it for sure. Ha, I don't know. I guess do you have thoughts on that before we
Yeah.
keep going?
I mean, what you're highlighting is the importance of the motivation. And it reminds me, I'm co-host of another podcast, AIX Higher Ed podcast, and we interviewed a group of students recently. And one of the questions I asked them, we interviewed two high school students, two college students, they've all used AI kind of extensively or done work with AI or had classes in AI. So we kind of want to get a sense from students that were a little further along in the learning curve about generative AI, what they thought about incorporating AI and so forth. One of the questions we asked is that how can instructors um, motivate students to do the hard work, right? I mean, and it's easy enough to outsource if you really don't want to do it, and that happens everywhere. But what makes you motivated to want to do that hard work? And so you're mentioning picking a topic. That's exactly what they were saying. If you can pick your own topics, if you can pick your own work that you want to do, you're going to pick something you care about. And then you want to do it well. You want to do it the right way. And that doesn't mean you don't use AI tools, but it means you make sure that you really understand the arguments, you understand the content, and you take it further. And that's one thing that is a really difficult thing to crack. I'm not sure that we've really gotten our heads around this. How do we make full use of the AI tools? Because the only way to do that is to really increase the motivation of students. And I'm torn on this because I'm very sympathetic to a lot of students that I think part of it comes down to curiosity. And there are a lot of aspects of traditional schooling where we drive the curiosity out. You think about a little kid, they have tons of questions, and sometimes annoyingly so, right? And they're just, why? And they really want to know all these things. And then when they get to school, they're told, well, that's fine. You want to know why, but we're talking about this. Everybody has to focus on this topic. And the students they can't really explore their individual topics very easily. It's not designed for that to be the case. And we don't have the resources. You can't fault the teachers. They're told they have to meet certain expectations for the curriculum to get students ready for standards of learning exams. And that's what the school is measured on. And so I get that. And that's where we are. But I also see that you get students that go through that process. And one of the concerns we have when they get to college is how do we spark that curiosity again? Because the students that have that curiosity and that passion about their major, there's no holding them back, right? I mean, they're going to take off with it. They're going to be able to do some really amazing work. And those are typically the students that do the most advanced work, that do the most impressive research project, their individual capstone project. They do the internships. But if not motivated to do it, they're not going to be able to do it. So
Yeah.
how do we spark that?
I
And the
have a
thing,
lot of thoughts
yeah.
on that because that was something for me. Well, one, I've got a funny anecdote too. My cousin, um, he told me a story a couple months ago. His daughter's like 5. She woke him up at like 3 in the morning to ask why numbers existed, and I was like, okay, yeah, um,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
But that was something that was quick, like quickly kind of taken away from me in school. School was not my friend. And then I started to like refigure it out junior, senior year at Mary Washington, the things that I liked and was curious about. And that's also why I am doing the podcast. I joke that I've given myself a free undergrad's worth of education over 250 episodes. But yeah, I don't know, because like you said, you can't really fault the teachers, but there's so many like I don't know, it was tough. Like I have a lot of feelings about how school went, how I went through it myself, how I wish I had opportunities to maybe more openly pursue things that I was curious about, but
Yeah.
also understand that it is the way it is. And then I wish I had figured that out earlier at Mary Washington because by the time I figured it out, it was kind of the path was set
Mhm.
in terms of major. And it's like, okay, you need these things. You still need your last two writing intensives, so you got to do this. And so I tried to do it where I could in terms of picking topics for presentations or papers, things that I liked. Um, and once I figured it out by accident, really. And I figured it out by accident. It was a class called Geography of Sacred Spaces.
Mhm.
And I did the paper on how some soccer stadiums could be construed as sacred spaces. And I was like, I could have just done this the whole time. So I figured it out by accident. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a tough one for the instructors, and especially if you're not motivated in the class,
Yeah.
then and you can outsource it to ChatGPT, then like somebody who's bright is just gonna, I don't care, ChatGPT write this for me, and then they're not gonna learn anything. And that was the other thought that I had in terms of I feel like we as a society are in kind of a K shape in a lot of things, both
Mhm.
economically, intellectually. You mentioned like outsourcing the cognitive work to ChatGPT, and I don't
Yeah.
really know how to solve for that because the people that don't do any of the cognitive work. I think there's been some studies in terms of like if you use it too much, then you like stop learning how to think critically. And
Yeah.
then, but if you use it the right amount and like learn how to prompt it properly, then the K shape starts to happen. And we see this like with income in terms of like
Mhm.
wealth building and net worth and things like that. And I see it in a lot of areas, and I don't really know what the solve for that is. And I think or university might be one of the important ways to like fix that a little bit.
Mhm.
I don't, do you
Yeah,
have thoughts
certainly.
on
But
that?
yeah, a lot of thoughts, unfortunately, and a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, I think that this is an unlock that we really haven't been able to get to yet. A couple of things to say first. In defense of traditional education, you can't take what I'm kind of outlining or about even more so about to outline too far, because if you just let students just write about whatever they want to write about,
Of course.
then at some point they still need to learn the basic content that we think is important. And if they have no interest in ethics, well, I still want them to learn about ethics, right? I still want
Yeah.
them to learn how to write.
Let
I
me,
still
let me,
want them to
one
learn
real
mathematics.
quickly on the soccer sacred spaces one. It was close enough that Dr. Finlayson asked me if I wanted to do more research on it. And I was like, but playing soccer is more fun. So, anyways, but yeah, no, no, no.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm with you.
But at the same time, we've got to find ways for students to be able to self-direct their education, and that's the sweet spot. How do we get students to the point where they can self-direct it and they're driving it so hard that they're able to learn much faster, more efficiently? There was a really great study from the World Bank Africa about a year ago that they did a study in a school in Nigeria where they gave students tablets with AI tutor bots. And what they found is for the students that were attending regularly, and they controlled for this because some students, it's not that they didn't want to go to school, but sometimes they had other demands, family demands, and whatever. They weren't able to attend as regularly. But those that attended regularly took it seriously, those motivated students, within about what was it, in about 6 weeks, they jumped ahead 2 years worth of learning, what they would typically take 2 years to learn. And I don't, it sounds, fantastical, but I don't think that it is. I think that's very realistic. It's how do we get students in that instance where they can do it? But you can't just hand a tablet to all kids and expect them to self-direct without knowing what that looks like, how it's done, and to get that motivation level up. So it doesn't work unless they're motivated, and they're highly motivated to be able to explore topics and work through it. They see what the pot of gold is at the other end, at the end of the rainbow. How do they get there? Is up to them, and we've got to find a way to find that path for them. And that's difficult. It's I'm also very aware that whatever we're doing with introducing generative AI into our skill set and to our workflow, there will be costs, and part of it is the atrophy of certain skill sets, and we have to have our eyes open to this, and look at past examples. I used to be able to, when I was learning how to drive, we would go get fold out maps, right? And learn how to read a map and figure out how you're going to travel somewhere. And now I go to campus 15 minutes away and I have my GPS showing me the best way. Now I rationalize it's because it has traffic info that I wouldn't have. And I don't want to be stuck in the traffic behind a traffic accident or something. But I can't read maps nearly as well as I did before. And if you find that you're not reading very often, when you go back to read, it's a little harder, right? We're not exercising that muscle. There was even a quote I read recently in the last week or so from Andre Karpathy, who is one of the best known computer programmers and kind of a leading mind in AI. And he's worked at OpenAI and he's done a lot of work. And he was talking about the agentic AI tools he's using now for coding. He's one of the top coders in the world. But he said he's using them so much, he sees great capabilities. He's able to 10x or more his output, but he feels like his coding skills are starting to atrophy. He's not using the coding skills the same way before. So we have to be aware that when we start introducing it in certain ways, if I'm using my microphone to voice type, then I'm slowly going to get worse at typing. That's just naturally going to happen. My handwriting is horrible anymore because I hardly ever handwrite anything. Even on my phone, I'll type it out. Or I have something that'll recognize my handwriting, my chicken scratch handwriting, and it'll convert it if I can. But I don't handwrite things very often. And I used to all the time. So there will be costs associated with it. And what we need to also think about when we're making these changes, it'd be easy to say, let's just go toward this self-directed educational process, give everybody a tutor bot. Let's think about what that's going to mean. How do we make sure students are motivated? And that's one thing if you have a student that's never had that curiosity driven from them. But what about those students that have? And they've had the experience that you've had or others have had where they don't feel they're able to take over their own education or direct their own education. How do we get them back onto that path and that track? And how do we do it with all the expectations that we have for traditional education that has certain learning outcomes in place, standards of learning protocols? And I want to rebel against that. I want to tear a lot of that down, but we shouldn't do that until we know what we're going to build in its place.
Mm, yeah, yeah, I don't disagree. I think yeah, lots of questions. It does feel like we're on the forefront, even though
Yeah.
if you want to say early was 3 years ago or whatever, it does still feel like we're a bit early into it.
Yeah.
Um, but it also doesn't feel like it's slowing down anytime soon. So
No, it seems like it's getting faster and faster. I
yeah.
mean, it's
So
astonishing.
what are some of the things that you're teaching students about how to use it properly? Things to look out for, which tools are better at different things, right? There's Opus Clips, there's
Yeah.
Claude,
Yeah.
there's Gemini, there's ChatGPT, there's Perplexity, there's all these things. What are you teaching to your students in terms of how to use it responsibly, things to look out for, things like that?
I'd say let's break it into two buckets. The first would be the introductory material that students really need. They need a sense of AI literacy, and they need some fluency with the tools. But before they even get to using the tools, they need to understand how does the tool work. It is generative. It's not predictive. It's predictive. It's not recalling information. It's too often people think it's like Google. No, it's not really. Google is very different, and it's a very different tool set. And what does it mean for it to be predictive and generating those tokens and those ideas? That's why it hallucinates. What does it mean to be based off of training data that's biased? How does that exhibit in the outcome? What does this mean for visual tools? We've offered a course last summer, the Intro to AI, one credit class, and I put it together as asynchronous. So it was a series of modules, short video lecture from me, dummies, some materials, some readings, discussion boards, short assignments. We made it available for free to all UMW students, returning and incoming students. And we had 250 students sign up. So they were able to get one free credit for completing it. And what was great about it, and the feedback was very positive. And I think I gave them a simple rating at the end, give us out of 5 stars, got a 4.7 star rating because they said they felt like they had a foundation. And actually working with local school districts to figure out how do we do this at a much earlier age, because students need this earlier. So thinking about, I'm kind of designing that right now for ninth graders. What do students need to know about how it works? What training data is like? What are the ethical concerns? What does that mean for environmental issues? What does this mean for academic integrity? How do you consider this when you're looking at possible career options in the future? Just to get them to start to grapple with some of these questions, to know enough that they can start to think about it critically, and not to deter them from using it, but that get them to think about realistic use and responsible use. And that's incredibly important. Then at the other end, starting to get into upper level courses where teaching them about using some of the tools. Part of it is the same approach we've always taken with communication and digital studies. It's not about teaching a particular tool, because the tools will change. So I remember 10 years ago thinking, we're not going to teach somebody how to use Premiere Pro because it will be different by the time they graduate, and they might move into a company that is using a different tool. So let's not certify them in a particular tool set as much as a fluency with that kind of tool. And so some of that also plays into what we're doing with different AI tools. You know, whether they're going to use Gemini or Claude or OpenAI's models, they need to understand how a chatbot works. How do they build their own chatbot? What's a RAG system? What's Magentic system? And I think a lot of it comes down to a more general skill set that I think is really important. And that is some of the durable skills that we've always said were important: those writing skills, oral communication skills, critical thinking, research. And then we move into the collaborative and leadership skills. We've always had some collaborative skills there. And you've probably had experiences with group work where you're assigned to a group and people complain because there's going to be somebody loafing, there's somebody that's going to take the lead. And even when the others don't want them to take the lead, but there's a lot of negotiation there that has to take place. And those are important humanistic skills that students need to develop. We need even more of that, for a couple of different reasons. Part of it is that that's a particular interaction and a dynamic that students need to retain and to build, because I'm very worried about students becoming kind of isolated. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of isolation that's happening now. Part of it was COVID, part of it is technological change, but it's much easier just to sit on your own computer or your own phone and not have to interact with humans, not even talk on the phone. We need to incorporate more of that into the classwork, just because they need to be reminded of what it means to be human and to be able to negotiate that and have that empathy. But it's also important to develop those collaborative skill sets from a purely practical perspective, to think about how do you incorporate an agentic workflow into your own workflow, because you need to be able to collaborate with it, you need to manage it, you need some leadership skills. This is the last thing that I've been working on this past year, and talking a lot about early on, and now we're seeing glimmers of where it's really happening in the enterprise, and that is the leadership supervisory skills. You know, 6 months ago when they talked about agentic AI, still pretty superficial. You might have an agent, but there was only so much it could really do. It's more like deep research. You give it a complicated task, it would go off for half an hour, come back with the results. And that was agentic, but it was very limited. Now, when we're looking at, especially like computer programmers or computer scientists are working with, they're dealing with multiple parallel agents, that their workflow is no longer sitting there and typing a bunch of code and then working on refining it. They're tasking multiple parallel agents to work on different aspects of that code, and then they supervise it. And so what we really need to prepare students for is to not just be ready for an entry level job, because in the past we figured they were going to be able to develop those supervisory skills in the workplace, and that was what most workplaces expected. Now employers are looking for those supervisory, those management skills for entry level workers. And the way they're exhibiting that is that they're not hiring entry level workers as much. That's part of the cratering of entry level jobs in the labor market. And so they're not even telling us, hey, we want college graduates to have supervisory skills, but what they're acting on is that they're hiring people with those middle management or retaining people with those management and supervisory skills. We've been working on trying to incorporate a lot of that in the curriculum, even with new courses that we're developing right now, to make sure that students can learn some of that management theory. And it's even for people that aren't in business, but everyone to understand enough about management theory and figuring out how do we adapt it to AI work so that they can supervise, they can manage, they can collaborate with agentic work. And I think that'll make them better prepared for whatever field they're going to go into.
When you talk about the leadership stuff, that to me is always interesting because that's been every company has leadership seminars and they bring people in to talk about leadership and there's leadership textbooks and all these other stuff. And the one thing that I always ask, whether it's like the head of HR at some giant company or a leadership consultant or any of these things, they can give you all the things on paper. But to me, at least, you have to come across as authentic or genuine. And that's something that's very difficult to teach. Um, because you can have somebody that says all the things that were in the leadership textbook, and you can still feel like, yeah, I don't really want to listen to that guy or that
Yeah,
girl or whatever. How, and that comes with, it's a much deeper sort of like, you need to have confidence in who you are as a person. And then, so how
yeah,
is that thought process going into this too? Because that goes across not just AI, but just everything. Like it doesn't even have to be from a leadership perspective, but like it helps obviously with leadership.
yeah.
But is that sort of thing like getting thought out as well with students? Because when you're a college student, you don't know what you're doing. It's like sometimes it's tough to
Yeah.
to like be confident in who you are. You're like, I don't know what I want to do. Am I going home for the summer? Am I going to have an apartment next year? Nobody's hiring me. Life sucks. And it's tough to
Yeah.
do that. But like you still have to figure that out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's deeper than that, right? Because your job doesn't make you who you are. Your
Mhm.
where you live doesn't make you who you are. Your degree doesn't make you who you are. It's like the underlying things make you who you are. So is that part of it as well?
It definitely is. And I think the twist to it is that, I mean, I'm really focusing on this partly from kind of a humanistic perspective. I think it's really important that students learn to develop some leadership skills, some collaborative skills, and not everybody's going to be the same kind of leader or even assume leadership roles, but you still need to have an understanding of what it means to be a leader, which is really being respected or understood and incorporated and encouraged by others. And so leadership can take a lot of different forms. The other twist to this is that when we're thinking about leadership within the use of a lot of AI tools, we also have to think about the other category of, in the past, most students would graduate and they would work in some, even a small business, they would have a supervisor, they would have people they're working with, and they're part of a structure. There's a bigger push for people to be very entrepreneurial. And that's the way we're approaching this, is looking at entrepreneurial, or even there's the term entrepreneurial skills, where the leadership is about risk taking, about understanding challenges, being able to look at problems and develop solutions. And whether that's leadership of AI bots in some instances or other people, part of it is also just about identifying what's that dynamic look like. There's a big push for people to be entrepreneurial and maybe even have, and you've probably heard this sense of a one person unicorn, right? Somebody is going to build a company that's worth $1 billion and they're the only employee. And there are more and more companies now that are working with fewer employees. I heard Sam Altman recently, and he was talking at an open forum a couple of days ago about how $1 billion company, not long ago could maybe as few as 200 employees, and that was pretty small. Now they're down to maybe 20 employees can build $1 billion company. That's a very different dynamic. We're not looking at the same leadership skills for a CEO of a 20-person corporation than if she were leading 200 or 2,000, or a generation or two ago, it might have been 30,000 people to be able to build a $1 billion company. That's a very different communication strategy. It's a different dynamic, and it's a different kind of interaction. So leadership is changing. At the very least, I think for undergraduates, we need to make sure that they're given a lot of practice. So we should be incorporating more project-based learning, having them work together on projects, identify problems, work on solutions, and expect them to fail. And they need to be given permission to fail. And failing
Yeah,
at a
yeah, yeah.
project doesn't mean you fail the class. Sometimes you'll learn a lot more from that failure. And we've got to incorporate that in, because I think that students have been taught to be fairly risk averse. And I think part of it is kind of a traditional educational structure where you don't want to take risks because you know what's on that rubric and you know what you need to do to be able to get the B or the A or whatever grade it is that you're looking for. Why would you do something different? And so I have fewer students that are taking those risks. And I think about the importance of taking those risks risks, and not penalizing somebody for doing it. As long as they're doing it in a thoughtful way and they're still demonstrating that they're learning something from it or they've contributed in some important way, we've got to be able to incorporate that into the coursework. So, what I'm actually working on right now and with some colleagues is a certificate program that would be AI in practice. And we're first thinking about this for people from the workplace to come back and be able to take these courses. But we really want to integrate everything that we've been talking about. There's an AI literacy course, Intro to AI. There is a course that's all about small group communication and collaboration, and they really have to collaborate with other humans and people to work on these projects. There's management and entrepreneurial skill sets that are taught in courses 3 and 4. And then there's a capstone where they actually build something and they work on it, and they're able to produce something and figure out how do these tools work within their workflow, what that might look like in the future. So it's very practically oriented. It's incorporating a lot of these tools, but it doesn't forget all the humanistic skills that I think are vital to success in an AI world. And I think it'll really set them up for success well. And hopefully it also then gives them maybe that entry point that you were talking about before, is the recognition that, hey, I can direct a lot of this education, and maybe I don't want to just stop with these 5 classes. Maybe there's something else I want to do with this, and maybe they'll come back and get the masters in AI and business that our College of Business is going to be offering very soon, or other programs that we might have, or thinking about what they could do in the classics and how that leads to work that they're going to do in AI. I just think there's a lot of possibility there. What we need to provide is a bit of a foundation in terms of how AI works in the liberal arts, some fluency, some literacy, and then let them see the sky's the limit. And then figure out what their path is going to be able to access that, to be able to build their own knowledge base, to build their skill set, and to give them some direction in terms of, this is what we know is going to be important, this is what we think is going to be important, and this is how you can start to work in that direction.
I love all that, and especially the risk-taking part and teaching them how to take risks. Risk management and in entrepreneurship is a huge piece of it, obviously. Um, so what do you think in terms of AI in the workplace, in terms of where things are going, things that you're seeing?
Yeah.
You mentioned event planning, you mentioned social media management, you mentioned marketing, some of the other kind of career fields that come out of the communications major. What are you seeing in those sorts of aspects in terms of use of AI, um, and more broadly, if you have other insights as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're seeing a number of different indicators from most workplaces. There are a number of businesses that are making investments in AI, incorporating some of the tools. Some are doing it better than others. And the ones that aren't doing it very well, typically they aren't given the the kind of the guidance, right? They need some professional development. I mean, if you're thinking about somebody that didn't grow up with these skills and didn't grow up with these tools, and they're still very new to them, they aren't really sure what to do with it. And so if you don't give them the training to show them what the capabilities are, it's not going to work. They also need to be given permission to try using it in very different, interesting ways. Think about if somebody's been in a workplace for, let's say, 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they're used to certain protocols and certain workflows, and all of a sudden you give them a tool that's meant to be disruptive, but you don't tell them they're allowed to disrupt the process, then they're not going to go out very far. They're not going to test its limits. So they really need to find a way to, and this is still in the early phases of how this disruptive technology is going to guide what it is that's happening. I think what's going to happen to change a lot of those practices is that you're going to start to see more companies that are really taking full use. And these aren't just startups that are using a lot of AI tools, but even more established companies. And most of these are coming from AI companies or tech companies where they're incorporating a lot of AI to be able to do things in a really transformative way. So when you're thinking about like an example of like Anthropic, which has Claude as its large language. I love using Claude. I follow the company quite a bit because it's a constitutional AI. It's very ethically safety driven. They had a recent example where they have something called Claude Code, and was really intended for people that are coders. You have a terminal interface, and that's kind of scary for people that don't have a tech background. Well, they realized that was starting to be used for different things, and it was really radically expanding the capabilities of a coder. If somebody was really running with it, they could easily 10x the kind of work that they were able to do. And the example of that was they wanted to create Claude Code for non-coders. So they created Cowork, which just came out about a week ago. What's astonishing about it, and I've been playing around with Cowork, it's really great. It's a good agentic workflow. You can actually have it managed to run multiple agentic workflows at the same time. And, I'm still just scratching the surface on it, but I think there are tremendous capabilities. what I really want to use as the illustration from this is they use Claude Code to make co-work. The
Mm.
programmer who built Claude Code, Boris Cherny, when he used Claude Code to build co-work, he said they built it in 10 days and it was all coded by Claude Code. Now, when you talk about a disruption of workflow and practice and protocols, there's not a tech company that a year ago was doing anything like that. So what we're going to see is some companies are just going to take off in terms of what the capabilities are by using some of the tools. That's going to force some others to try and keep up. And it's really mostly centered on tech companies right now, but it's going to start filtering into a lot of other companies, certainly a lot of consulting companies. When I saw McKinsey now, when they're hiring people, they have them go through a test where they're checking to see how well they can prompt a chatbot and detect the outcome and verify the outcome. So they're already thinking about how to integrate it into the workflow. But other companies are going to try and catch up and figure out how can we do this, because they know if they don't, if you're trying to compete with a company that can 10x what you're able to do with the same number of resources or fewer resources, you're not going to be in business very long. So I think that's going to change. So how do we prepare students for that? I think it's going to be different 6 months from now than it is now. And we don't even know what it's going to look like. I mean, even students that are seniors, I'm not sure how to fully prepare them for that, other than for them to have a sense of flexibility, to understand things are changing very rapidly, that they need to learn how to learn. Because if they can teach themselves some of these tools, it really comes down to something like in the last week, if they were out of the workplace and they had access to Claude Cowork and they could teach themselves how to use it, they could lead in whatever office they're in. They could figure out how this is going to work, and they could take that to their supervisor, to their coworkers, and let them know this is what I found we could do with this, and I've been able to test this out. They need to have that kind of facility with it. It's not just about young students having, being digital natives. That's not it. It's about any worker having the permission to experiment, having the knowledge about how to do it safely and responsibly, but then the flexibility to learn how to learn. You can't just figure out, hey, 6 months from now, we should have a professional development workshop. And that's going to get everybody up to speed. Things are going to be different by then. I'm working with a group and they've asked me to come and give a talk to a group of executives in June. And they want to know what we're going to talk about. I said, well, here's what I think I'm going to talk about, but I think it's going to change so radically by then. Why don't we talk again in May? Because I think there are going to be different aspects of what I would do. If I were giving that talk today, this is exactly what I would do. But I don't know when that next co-work is going to come out, or when the next change in agentic workflow is going to look like, or what the training is going to look like. I think it's just changing so rapidly. All that we can really equip our students with, and the best thing we can equip any of ourselves with, is flexibility, the ability to learn how to learn, and some of those foundational skills. I think if you have those durable skills and you have some facility with some of these tools and you're willing to try, you're going to be in pretty good shape.
What are what are some of your preferences in terms of at least chatbots? We've got ChatGPT, Grok,
Yeah.
Claude, Perplexity. What are your
Yeah.
preferences, or maybe what are some of the pros and cons of each of them if people are
I still
curious about
subscribe to
trying them?
quite a few of them. The only one I don't, I have some concerns about XAI and Grok, and I've used it and all, but given some of the things they've done, including the recent scandal on X of people being able to create undressed images of other people, it just really bothers me. I'm really concerned about what are the ethical guidelines for using it. So I try to stay away from XAI. Use it enough to understand what it's capable of doing, and it seems very capable, and there's a lot of funding behind it and training, but that I don't use very regularly. ChatGPT, I still have I guess it's the pro subscription, $20 a month, and I use it
Hmm.
quite a bit for some of the GPTs that I've built for regular workflow. When I'm producing materials for the podcast, for instance, I have a GPT that'll help with putting together materials, and some other things that I'm able to do there. I think it's very good. The deep research there is very helpful. I like it a lot. It's very good at it's reasonably good at kind of analyzing content. Gemini, I really like for Nano Banana. I think Nano Banana is phenomenal for visuals. I really like that a lot. I think its deep research is excellent, and I use a lot of Google products, so it's integrated within that into that sphere, and it's easier to use. I can incorporate it with Drive documents and create documents very easily, and so I like that a lot. And I use that quite a bit for verifying sources, looking at materials, and producing some basic content. I find myself primarily using Claude. And there are a couple of reasons why. I mentioned before, I like the company because it was probably a little more focused on safety and alignment issues. So I really like the approach they've taken. I also find that Claude 4.5 Opus is just a phenomenal writer. It really does have kind of expansive analytic capabilities that ways that I just don't find others are able to do as consistently. I think with ChatGPT 5.2, it's excellent, and then sometimes I'll interact, and some of it is kind of the built-in router. It doesn't give me as expansive a response. I have a little more control over that in Claude, and so I'm able to do a lot more with it. I also am just really impressed with what Claude's done with co-work. I've been spending a lot of time with that. Yesterday, I just started playing around with their add-in to Excel, and it looks phenomenal. I've read some really great things about it. I've just been playing with it, and you can build your own spreadsheets to be able to do specific functions, and that's kind of cool. So I've been using Claude quite a bit for that.
Nice. Well, aside from the fact that it's going to change rapidly, in terms
Yeah,
of the future of what AI holds for us and generative AI, right? People will talk about, oh, the robots are coming to kill us all, and they'll launch all the nukes and all these other things that,
yeah.
well, hopefully don't happen. But what are your thoughts on kind of where it's going, right? We've touched earlier on kind of the exponential growth and how quickly it's going. Do you have any sort of, like you said earlier, a look around the corner at maybe what's coming next?
As far as the safety issues, I am worried. I am concerned about a number of things. I think it's all moving too fast. There was a really great talk at Davos, the World Economic Forum, this last week, and they had Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, with Demis Hassabis, who's the CEO of Google DeepMind, and they were talking a bit about how fast things are going. They're saying getting to AGI within possibly a year or two, more likely between 5 and 10 years. But there's no question that they think it's going to get there. It's just a question of how fast. And they both kind of agreed that they wish it could slow down, but they don't think it's going to. So I guess the reason I'm worried about that is that there's so little room within that timeline for regulation or for really critical reflection on what this means. The Grok example is a good example of that. I would assume that the engineers that are working on it were not looking for something that was going to do harm, but because they felt they needed to compete, they were putting something out there to be able to increase exposure for the tool, and it didn't change very quickly. I think in the past there would have been more checks against that kind of concern. I think as far as like where this goes, I'm very concerned about the transition. I think that I do a lot of reading from futurists and trying to figure out where does this go if it really gets to artificial generalized intelligence. If we really get to models that are able to do so much more than humans in all categories, and I think there's a great chance for huge economic growth. But I'm not sure how we get there without disruptions to the labor market. If we get to the point where there are 10, 15, 20% or more unemployment, I don't think our society's ready for that. I don't think our government's ready for that. I don't think anybody's really thought about what does that look like. You hear things like universal basic income thrown around. I don't know where that money is going to come from. I mean, I think eventually when they have that level of abundance, but I don't think the billionaires that have enough abundance now are willing to give it up at this stage. I'm not sure why they would fund universal basic income now or later. I worry about what the job prospects are going to look like for a lot of people. At the same time, I think there's tremendous opportunity for people that want to be entrepreneurial, unlike anything I've ever seen. I mean, if you can vibe, you don't even need that much of a technical background, but the ability to play around with it and be able to do your due diligence to make sure you're producing something that's safe and not going to do harm. But to be able to vibe code some product and to be able to get it to market, I think people and students and really anybody in this economy, there's a tremendous opportunity there. But at the same time, I really worry about anybody that's thinking about a traditional career. I think that's going to be changed radically. And I don't even know when I talk to my own kids what it's going to look like in 3 to 5 years. I think they have to expect it to be very, very different. And I don't know how we're going to prepare people for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm doing kind of the same myself with soccer coaching and other diversifying income streams and trying to figure out ways to I don't know, AI proof the
Yeah.
stuff that we got going on. So, yeah, it's tough for sure, and I think everybody's just trying to figure it out, and it is a little bit difficult, definitely. But um, I know you gotta get out of here in a little bit. Do you have any last nickels before we get you out of here?
I'd say when we're thinking about some of these issues, I just think we need a lot more societal discussion about a lot of these issues. We're trying to do that with on campus at the university and the Center for AI and Liberal Arts. We're sponsoring a lot of debates. We did a public debate on AI and the environment, for instance. We're in the middle of data center alley, and we should be talking about the impact the data centers have. I don't want to get rid of data centers. I think we're going to have a lot more data centers. Let's build them responsibly. Let's think about, I have a former student who works for a company that helps build data centers, and they've been able to build some that are able to reuse water instead of taking water out of freshwater streams, and be able to do it with minimizing impacts on the electrical grid. Let's find ways to do that responsibly. Let's have discussions about creativity and copyright. And I want to see AI continue to grow. I want to be able to see new capabilities, but I think we can do it in a way that's more responsible and respectful of copyright and creative work that's there. And we also need to have broader discussions about what these changes are going to look like. I think the next 6 months, we're going to see some tremendous changes. I mean, it's astonishing over the last 2 months what I've seen with some of the agenda capabilities and kind of Claude code opening a lot of people's eyes to what individuals are capable of doing. And if it goes anywhere close to that pace, then I think by the end of 2026, we're going to see this as a major issue in the midterm elections. I think most politicians are going to be talking about data centers, energy use, AI, job disruption, certainly. But I want them to also start talking about how do we look around the corner a little bit and to see what kind of society we wish to see. How do we build to that? Instead of just thinking defensively, we do need to think about some of those defensive issues, but we should also think about what do we wish to see in a positive sense? How do we want to envision what universal basic income would look like? How do we get to the point of abundance where maybe there is the opportunity to be able to support greater services for all people in the country and hopefully around the world if we really get to that scenario? And there's a possibility of that, but how do we engineer that? How do we design it? And that's not going to come about without some big discussions. The last thing I would say about this is there are always questions about alignment, and they reference human AI alignment, value alignment. We want to make sure AIs are aligned with human values, but we don't have one set of values. When you think about every culture, every society, even within the United States, there are so many different value sets that are not necessarily at odds with each other, but there's some friction there, and there's some challenges. We need to have more discussions about human to human alignment, and what our value systems are, and what it is that we really want to see happen, and why we value that outcome. That's probably the most important role for humans in all of this, is helping design what that's going to look like, helping to guide it. And we can't expect AI to be aligned with us if we can't be aligned with one another.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and Elon, I think, also echoed that about the UBI, that universal basic income, that he's hoping that AGI will provide so much abundance that like that's going to be possible and probable. Um, but yeah, tell the people if go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a real chance of that. I mean, I think that there's a real possibility we get to that age of abundance that just sounds like science fiction at this stage, but we could get there. But it's the transition that worries me. It's how do we get there? Because you could also then, if we don't act in the right way in the short term, there's no way we get to that age of abundance, or at least where everybody has access to that abundance.
Hmm. And then you kind of end up at the question of how do people find meaning if they don't have to do anything?
Yeah.
And that's probably a whole nother podcast by
Yeah.
itself. Tell the people if they want to go check out your podcast or any of your work, where should they go?
Absolutely. I'll share a link hopefully in the comments or in the description for this video. It's the AIX Higher Ed podcast. I co-host that with Stefan Bauschert, an old friend and colleague. We've been working on a number of things together, a number of publications, and trying to share some of these messages for AI in education. You can also find me at the University of Mary Washington, and you can find my email address there on that website. And you can look for the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts. And on our website for the center, we have upcoming events that are open to the public debates, speakers, and different activities that we have for students that are also open to the public, including pitch contests. We've had some students working on some vibe coded products that they're pitching, and that's a great way for them to start thinking about that risk taking that we were talking about before.
Very nice. For those listening, links will be in the description as always. Very much appreciate your time. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Thanks so much, Eric. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you you want to subscribe, click there.